For years, we lived under the rule of an HOA that acted less like a neighborhood association and more like a dictatorship. And at the center of it all was Karen Mitchell, our HOA president. She treated the community like her personal kingdom, using the rulebook as her weapon of choice. But as long as she left my family alone, I figured we could manage. That was until last Tuesday morning when I found an orange notice taped to my front door. It wasn't just a warning, it was a declaration of war. Immediate HOA fee increase, $500 per month. Violation, excessive vehicles on property. I stood there on the front porch reading those words over and over. My hands shook as I held the paper. They were charging me extra because we had too many cars in our own driveway. 3 cars. That's all it was. My work truck, essential for running my construction business. My wife's SUV, so she could get to her shifts at the hospital. And the used Honda we just bought for our daughter's 16th birthday. 3 cars, parked on our own property. I glanced out the kitchen window and there she was, Karen, doing her usual morning inspection. Clipboard tucked under her arm, phone in hand, snapping pictures of my driveway like she was documenting a crime scene. That was the 3rd time she'd done it this week. My wife, Sarah, called out from the living room. "She's out there again." I clenched my teeth. "Let her look." Sarah sighed. "Maybe we should park the Honda in the garage, just until this blows over." "No." I poured myself a cup of coffee, trying to keep my voice calm. "We're not hiding our daughter's car like we're doing something wrong." The truth was we couldn't fit another thing in the garage. It was packed full of Sarah's medical gear and my work equipment. We'd explained that in detail at the last HOA meeting. Karen hadn't cared. She'd barely looked up from her phone when I spoke. "Rules are rules, Mr. Thompson," she'd said with that smug little smirk. "Maybe if you can't manage proper garage storage, this neighborhood isn't for you." But there was something Karen didn't know, something none of them knew. While she was busy measuring grass height and issuing fines over mailbox colors, I'd been quietly buying up properties in our neighborhood. 5 years of careful investing. Different LLC names, different agents. No one connected the dots. What had started as a smart real estate move had turned into something far more personal. And now it was time. I stepped outside to get the mail. Took my time walking to the box. Karen was pretending to examine Mrs. Johnson's rose bushes, but I could feel her watching me. Poor Mrs. Johnson. She'd been fined last month because her roses were too vibrant and disrupted the neighborhood's color harmony. That's the level of ridiculousness we were dealing with. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A message from my lawyer. "Closing complete. You now own 67% of the development." I smiled as I slipped the phone back into my pocket. Karen started power walking toward me. That pink clipboard clutched to her chest like a shield. "Mr. Thompson," she called in that syrupy sweet voice she used when she was about to stab you in the back. "I assume you received our notice." "I did," I said evenly, "and I have a few legal questions about the basis for this fee increase." She waved her hand like she was swatting away a fly. "The board has full authority to issue fees. Perhaps if you attended more meetings, you'd understand how we operate." What she didn't know was that I'd attended every meeting, just not in person. I had proxies there, representing the properties I'd bought, and I had records, every fine, every complaint. Every time Karen had bent the rules for her friends and slammed the hammer down on everyone else. Karen turned to leave, heels clicking on the sidewalk. "Oh, and we're holding an emergency board meeting tonight. 7 o'clock sharp. We'll be addressing problem properties." She didn't even have to say it. We both knew who she meant. I went back inside and laid out the property maps on my desk. Each lot was highlighted and coded. 5 years of preparation spread out in front of me. Karen thought she was going to make an example of me. She had no idea who she was dealing with. The phone rang. Mrs. Johnson, sobbing about another violation notice. "They fined me again," she whispered, "for leaving my porch light on too late." I stared at the old photo on my wall. My dad standing proud in front of his first house before an HOA like this one drove him out. He taught me never to fight angry, fight smart. Tonight, Karen was going to learn that lesson the hard way. 7 o'clock came fast. I walked into the community center meeting room, and the tension was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Every seat was taken. People I'd lived near for years sat shoulder to shoulder, whispering to each other, casting nervous glances at the front. Karen was already there, of course. She'd gone all out, hired a photographer to take pictures of my driveway, made it look like some kind of car dealership. She called the meeting to order with her ridiculous pink glitter gavel. "As you can see from these professional photographs," she said, flipping through slides, "Mr. Thompson's property has become an unsightly car lot." There were gasps from her usual crowd, the same people whose kids left bikes in the yard for days without so much as a warning. I scanned the room. Mrs. Rodriguez rolled her eyes. She'd been fined for letting her grandson's car sit in her driveway while he fixed her roof. Mr. Chen was taking notes furiously. He'd been fined for parking slightly over his driveway line during a snowstorm. Karen clicked to a new slide, a zoom-in of my daughter's car. "This vehicle," she said, "has remained in the same place for more than 48 hours. She conveniently left out the part where our daughter was home from college for the weekend. The meeting dragged on. Karen presented charts showing supposed property value declines, anonymous complaints, probably written by her friends, and even weather reports claiming our cars caused extra snowdrifts. Then she pulled out a thick binder. "I've documented every vehicle entering and leaving the Thompson property over the last 3 months." My stomach turned. She'd been tracking us. People in the room shifted uneasily. That's when Sarah Jenkins, our next-door neighbor, stood up. "Karen," she said carefully, "isn't this a bit much? It's a family with 3 cars, not a used car lot." Karen snapped, "You're out of order. Sit down." Her husband Bob started handing out copies of a new bylaw proposal. 2 cars per household. Garage parking only. No exceptions. I almost laughed, but not quite. "We'll vote on the new restrictions now," Karen declared, ignoring the murmurs of protest. That was my moment. I stood up, slowly, straightened my tie. "Point of order, Madam President." Karen's gaze shot toward me. "You're not recognized, Mr. Thompson." "Actually," I said, holding up a folder, "according to Section 73 of our HOA bylaws, any property owner may raise a point of order during voting." The room fell silent. Karen's knuckles whitened on the podium. "Before we vote," I continued, "I think we should review the HOA's current ownership structure." I walked to the front of the room, my footsteps the only sound in the silence. I laid out the property map. "You see, over the past 5 years, Sunrise Properties has quietly purchased homes throughout this development, and as the CEO of Sunrise Properties, I now hold 67% ownership of this HOA." You could hear the collective gasp. "And that," I said, locking eyes with each board member, "gives me the majority vote." Karen's face went pale. She fumbled for her water bottle, knocking over her pink gavel. Bob rushed to whisper something in her ear. I already knew what he was saying. I wasn't just a homeowner anymore. I was the HOA. Phones came out. Neighbors were recording. Karen's hands trembled. The fear in her eyes was real now, and I wasn't finished. I turned to the crowd. "But before we discuss the board's future," I said, "let's talk about these invasive surveillance practices. The photos, the videos, the constant harassment." Murmurs turned into outraged whispers. Mrs. Johnson wiped a tear from her cheek. Mr. Chen's jaw was clenched. Sarah Jenkins was shaking her head in disbelief. Karen looked ready to bolt, and this was only the beginning. Karen froze with her hand on the door, staring back at the room like she couldn't believe what was happening. 20 years of controlling this neighborhood, and now it was slipping through her fingers. I walked back to my chair slowly, feeling the weight of every eye in the room watching me. Then I turned and opened another folder. "One more thing," I said. "Before we vote on anything tonight, I think we should review last year's pool renovation budget." That caught a few people's attention. Most of them had been wondering for months why the pool was still closed, even after the HOA claimed to have spent $50,000 on upgrades. I flipped on the projector and clicked through screenshots of bank transfers. Money moved from HOA accounts into a contractor's company. Except there was no contractor. It was a shell company registered to Karen's cousin in another state. The pool never got fixed because the money was never spent. Karen let out a strangled sound from the doorway. Bob was tugging at her arm, whispering something, but she wouldn't move. She was frozen there, staring at the screen as I kept clicking. Here's the purchase of a luxury SUV made 2 weeks after the final transfer, I said, bringing up another photo. Paid in full. The room was dead silent, but you could feel the mood shifting. People were no longer just angry. They were furious. Even Karen's most loyal supporters, the ones who always voted with her no matter what, looked sick. A few people stood up. Mrs. Rodriguez shook her head, muttering under her breath. I move to dissolve the board effective immediately, I said, and call for new elections. I second the motion, Mr. Chen said from 2 rows back. All in favor? I asked. Hands went up everywhere. I counted. It was more than enough. Karen tried to speak. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Bob let go of her arm and stepped away, as if he wanted no part of this anymore. She slowly walked back to her seat and sat down, her head in her hands. We'll hold elections in 2 weeks, I said, closing my folder. Until then, all enforcement actions are suspended. No more fines, no more letters, no more intimidation. There was a soft ripple of applause around the room. I let out a slow breath. We weren't done yet, not even close. But this was a start. The next morning, my phone blew up. Messages, emails, people stopping by the house. Some apologized, some thanked me. Some were just relieved it was over. But Karen wasn't done. By that afternoon, rumors were flying. Karen was telling anyone who would listen that I was planning to sell the whole development to a shady commercial developer, that I was going to bulldoze everything and turn it into a parking lot. She told people I was dangerous, that I was greedy, that I couldn't be trusted. And to my surprise, some people believed her. A few neighbors started giving me cold looks. Others whispered when I walked by. One guy even stopped me on the sidewalk and asked if it was true that I was planning to turn the community center into a casino. I shook my head. No casinos, I said. We're putting in a new playground. He didn't look convinced. I realized pretty quickly that Karen wasn't going to go quietly. She still had followers and she knew how to scare them. She'd spent years conditioning this neighborhood to obey her, to live in fear of losing property value or getting fined into the ground. And old habits die hard. But I had something Karen didn't have. Proof. That weekend, I invited everyone to the community center for an open house. No votes, no agendas. Just information. We served coffee and donuts, set up tables with charts, put out copies of every financial record I could get my hands on, showed people where their HOA fees had gone and where they hadn't. And then I told them the plan. We were going to fix the pool. Really fix it. We were going to clean up the park and add a basketball court. We'd set up a maintenance fund for elderly homeowners like Mrs. Johnson, so no one would have to choose between medicine and lawn service again. We'd hire a real management company to collect dues and keep everything transparent. And yes, people could park 3 cars in their own driveways. By the end of the meeting, even Karen's most loyal people looked like they were coming around. Not all of them, but enough. I thought maybe, just maybe, things would settle down. Then I got the lawsuit. Karen had filed an emergency motion in court, claiming I'd committed fraud by buying up properties through different companies. She wanted the court to freeze my HOA voting rights, and she wanted me removed from the board before I ever took office. I wasn't surprised. I'd been expecting it. What Karen wasn't expecting was what I had in return. Our lawyer showed up to court with a stack of evidence so thick the judge's eyebrows practically jumped off his face. Years of Karen waiving fines for her friends. Emails where she joked about raising fees on single parents and retirees. Expense reports showing trips to Maui paid for with HOA funds. But the moment that changed everything was when we played the security camera footage. Karen, on my lawn, at 3 a.m, measuring the height of my grass with a ruler, taking pictures of my daughter's car, placing violation notices on doors by flashlight. You could feel the courtroom shift in that moment. Even Karen's own attorney leaned away from her like he didn't want to catch whatever mess she just stepped in. And then came the testimony. 3 former board members stepped forward. They told the judge how Karen bullied them into signing off on fines, made them ignore violations when it suited her, and threatened to ruin anyone who stepped out of line. One of them even had a recording of Karen bragging about how she kept undesirable elements out of the neighborhood. The judge didn't hesitate. He threw out her lawsuit, ordered a full audit of the HOA, and removed Karen from the board on the spot. By the time we walked out of that courthouse, it was over, at least legally. But Karen, she wasn't quite done yet. The morning after the final hearing, news vans showed up on my lawn. Karen had called them. She thought the media would pressure me into stepping down, that I'd be embarrassed. She didn't know me very well. I walked right out to those reporters and handed them a binder. Color-coded spreadsheets, bank records, photos, every crooked thing Karen had ever done with HOA money. And when they asked me what was next, "We fix the pool," I said, "and then we fix everything else." The news story ran that night. Karen was quoted saying she was being forced out by big money developers. But by then, nobody was buying it. She packed up and moved within 3 weeks, and not quietly. Karen went door to door one last time before she left, warning people that without her, the neighborhood would fall apart. That crime would go up, that property values would crash. She left a flyer on my mailbox that said, "Be careful who you trust." The day she moved out, a parking ticket from her new HOA was stuck to her windshield. I stood on my porch and watched her drive away. I didn't wave. We held new elections 2 weeks later. 5 board members, each from a different part of the neighborhood. Mrs. Rodriguez, Mr. Chen, even Sarah Jenkins, the one who'd stood up at the meeting. No more unchecked power, no more shady deals. The new board rewrote the rules. Kids could play basketball in their driveways. People could plant vegetable gardens if they wanted. And as long as you parked your cars in your own space, no one cared how many you had. We still had an HOA, but now it worked for us. We used dues to fix things that mattered. The playground got rebuilt. The pool finally reopened. We even started a community garden on the spot where Karen used to take photos of lawn violations. Neighbors started talking to each other again, helping each other out. And property values? They went up. 15% in the first month after Karen left. Turns out, people like living in a place where they're treated with respect. Some of Karen's old allies even came by to apologize. They said they'd only gone along with her because they were scared. I believed them. I understood. Fear keeps people quiet, but not anymore. A few months later, I got a message from Karen's new neighborhood. Seems they had their own power-hungry HOA president, and they wanted advice on how to handle it. I thought about responding, I really did. But in the end, I decided it wasn't my fight. Sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's showing people how to stand up for themselves, and knowing they'll never need someone like Karen to keep them safe again. I stood in my driveway that night, watching my daughter pull in next to my wife's SUV. My work truck was already parked there. I smiled. 3 cars. No problem. Just a normal family, in a normal neighborhood, living free. Living